The grand chandeliers of the upscale bank shimmered as a well-dressed black man strode confidently through the entrance. His sharp but simple suit was neatly pressed, and a fine leather briefcase hung from his hand. With a polite nod, he greeted the receptionist, his voice calm yet commanding. From behind a glass-paneled office, Richard Holloway, the bank's manager, leaned back in his leather chair, narrowing his eyes as he watched the man approach. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He had seen men like this before, or so he thought. As the black man reached the counter, Richard subtly signaled to the teller, a young woman who hesitated before giving a tight nod. She knew exactly what that meant. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked cautiously. The man placed his briefcase on the counter, unlocking it with a quiet click. From inside, he pulled out a small card and slid it toward her. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," he said smoothly. The teller's eyes widened as she glanced at the numbers scrawled across the paper. A sum this large was far from routine. Uncertain, she stole a glance at Richard. Richard scoffed, stepping out from behind his desk. "A withdrawal," he repeated mockingly. "For that amount?" His chuckle was laced with arrogance as he shook his head. "And you expect us to believe this account is yours?" A few customers turned to watch. The atmosphere in the bank shifted, an unspoken tension filling the air. The black man remained composed. "Yes, that is my account. I can provide identification if necessary." Richard folded his arms, his smirk widening. "Oh, I'm sure you can, sir," he said with exaggerated politeness. "But large transactions like these require, let's say, extra verification." His condescending tone echoed across the room. The black man met his gaze steadily. "Then verify it," he said simply. Richard leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "How about you tell me where you really got that money?" The silence in the bank was deafening. Customers exchanged uneasy glances. The teller fidgeted nervously. The black man inhaled, his expression unreadable. "Call security if you need to," he said, his voice calm, almost indifferent. Richard let out a short laugh. "Oh, I plan to." With a snap of his fingers, he motioned to the bank's security guards, two towering men in navy uniforms, stationed by the entrance. "Escort this gentleman outside," Richard said smugly. The guards approached, their expressions blank. Just as they reached for the man's arm, their radios crackled to life. "Hold your positions! Hold your positions now!" The voice on the other end was urgent, almost frantic. The guards immediately halted, their bodies stiffening. Richard frowned, irritation flashing across his face. "What's the delay?" he snapped. One of the guards turned his head slowly, his face suddenly pale. His posture straightened as he stared at the black man in front of him, recognition dawning in his eyes. Then, to everyone's shock, he saluted. Richard's smirk disappeared. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. The guard spun toward him, his expression now one of disbelief. "Sir, this is Mr. Alexander Grant." Richard blinked, uncomprehending. "And that means—" The second guard swallowed hard before stepping forward. His voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Grant is the owner of this bank." The room fell into a stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The teller let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands shaking. Customers whispered in hushed voices. Richard's face went ghostly white. His mouth opened and closed, struggling for words. Alexander Grant, billionaire investor and sole shareholder of the bank, adjusted his cufflinks casually before locking eyes with the man who had mocked him moments ago. "You were saying, Mr. Holloway." His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Richard stumbled backward. "Sir, I didn't know, I mean—" Grant lifted a hand, cutting him off. "Save it!" The security guards turned to Grant for direction. "Orders, sir?" Grant studied Richard for a long moment before giving a slight nod. "Remove him from my bank." The guards wasted no time. They grabbed Richard by the arms, dragging him toward the exit. "Wait! This is a mistake! I was just doing my job!" Richard screeched, his voice rising in panic. The doors swung open. The last thing Richard saw was the stunned faces of his employees and customers, all staring at him in silent judgment. Inside, Alexander Grant turned back to the teller, whose hands were still shaking. "Now, about that withdrawal?" She nodded frantically. "Oh, of course, sir, right away." As he stepped forward, the whispers in the bank grew louder. The man they had doubted was the most powerful person in the building, and Richard Holloway had just mocked the owner of his own bank. The upscale bank hummed with quiet efficiency, its pristine floors gleaming under the golden glow of chandeliers. Customers moved about, some engaged in hushed conversations, others waiting in line, checking their phones or glancing impatiently at the tellers. Alexander Grant, a distinguished black man in his late 40s, approached the counter, his leather briefcase in one hand. His suit, though understated, was perfectly tailored, exuding quiet wealth. With a polite smile, he slid a card across the counter to the young teller. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," he said in a calm, measured tone. The teller took the card, her eyes flicking over the name and the amount scribbled onto the transaction request. Her breath hitched. The number was staggering. More than she had ever seen withdrawn at once. Her fingers trembled slightly as she glanced toward the bank manager's office. Through the glass panel, Richard Holloway sat in his sleek leather chair, tapping away at his computer. The teller hesitated for a moment before leaning in and whispering, "I'll just need to get approval for this." Alexander nodded, maintaining his composed demeanor. He had expected some verification. After all, it wasn't every day someone made such a sizable transaction. The teller quickly scurried over to the manager's office, knocking hesitantly before slipping inside. Through the glass, Alexander saw Richard's expression shift as the teller spoke. At first there was mild disinterest, then a flicker of something darker. His lips curled into a smirk, his eyes narrowing as he flicked his gaze toward Alexander. It was the kind of look that said he had already made up his mind. Moments later, Richard emerged, his arms crossed over his chest. His stride was slow, deliberate, the walk of a man who thought he owned the room. The murmur of the bank quieted slightly as he approached, his voice loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "Well, well, well. What do we have here?" Richard mused, his tone dripping with mock amusement. His sharp blue eyes traveled over Alexander with barely concealed disdain. "And what exactly do you need that much money for?" Alexander met his gaze steadily. "That's my business," he replied coolly. Richard let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, come on now," he said, his voice tinged with condescension. "A guy like you walking in here, requesting that amount?" He whistled. "Gotta say, it raises a few red flags." A few heads turned, some customers exchanged uneasy glances, others simply lowered their eyes, pretending not to listen. Alexander remained unfazed. "If there's a verification process, then follow it," he said. "I don't have all day." Richard chuckled, shaking his head as if he had just heard a ridiculous joke. Of course," he said, but there was an unmistakable mocking undertone in his voice. He turned to the teller. "Go ahead, pull up the account," he instructed. "Let's see what's really going on here." The teller hesitated but obeyed, her fingers clicking nervously on the keyboard. Richard leaned on the counter, his smirk widening. "You wouldn't believe how many people come in here trying to pull scams," he continued. "Fake checks, stolen identities, wire fraud, happens all the time. And let me guess." He narrowed his eyes at Alexander. "You don't have proper documentation, do you?" Alexander exhaled slowly, maintaining his composure. "I have multiple forms of ID," he said, pulling out his wallet. "Driver's license, passport, business credentials, whatever you need." Richard barely glanced at them before waving dismissively. Mm-hmm. Sure. But you see, large transactions like these require extra verification. Safety measures. Can't have just anyone walking in here claiming to own accounts with… Let's see. He peeked over at the teller's screen. His eyes widened slightly before his smirk returned. Oh, wow. That's a lot of zeros. He let out another mocking laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, I don't buy it. Alexander's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. If you don't buy it, run the verification process. Do your job. Richard clicked his tongue. Oh, don't worry. We'll run it, he said. But first, I'll need you to fill out some additional paperwork. He snapped his fingers, signaling the teller. She hesitated before handing Alexander a stack of forms. Alexander flipped through them, his expression darkening. This is excessive, he said. I've been banking here for years. You don't ask other customers to fill out these forms for simple withdrawals. Richard feigned surprise. Oh? You've been banking here for years? He tapped his chin dramatically. That's funny. I don't recall seeing you here before. Alexander stared at him for a long moment. Maybe that's because you weren't paying attention. Richard's smirk didn't falter. Or maybe it's because people like you don't usually belong in places like this. The air in the bank went deathly silent. A few customers gasped. One woman grabbed her purse and hurried toward the door, uncomfortable with the growing tension. Alexander's grip on his briefcase tightened. Excuse me? Richard leaned in slightly, voice low but taunting. I mean, come on. A guy like you, dressed like this, walking in here claiming to have that much money? He let out a soft chuckle. What is this, some kind of lottery win? Or are we dealing with another fraud case? Alexander's patience was running thin. He took a steady breath. I will say this one more time. Run the verification. Richard rolled his eyes. Fine, he sighed. But you see, background checks take time, and you don't exactly look like you're in the right tax bracket for an account this size. So maybe you can just take a seat, and we'll get around to you when we have time. Alexander had dealt with racism before, but this wasn't just about inconvenience. It was deliberate humiliation. I see what you're doing, Alexander said, his voice colder now. Richard raised an eyebrow. Oh? And what's that? You think if you make this difficult enough, I'll just walk away, that I'll get frustrated and leave? Alexander placed his hands on the counter, leaning forward slightly. That's not happening. Richard scoffed. Oh, please, it's not my fault you can't prove you belong here. The security guards at the entrance exchanged glances, sensing the escalating tension. I belong here more than you realize, Alexander said, his voice like steel. Richard laughed again, loud enough for everyone to hear. Right. Let me guess. You're some big shot, huh? Just another broke guy pretending to be rich. More whispers. Some customers awkwardly shuffled away, sensing something bigger unfolding. Alexander exhaled through his nose, his patience dangerously thin. Call security, Richard said over his shoulder. Escort this gentleman out. We don't have time for games. Alexander didn't move. He didn't flinch. But seconds later, everything changed. Before the guards could act, their radios crackled to life. Hold your positions! Hold your positions now! The shift in energy was instantaneous. The security guards froze. The teller gasped. Richard's smirk flickered just slightly. Then, one of the guards slowly turned his head toward Alexander and saluted. Richard blinked. The guard's voice was hoarse. Sir, this is Mr. Alexander Grant. Richard stared at him, confused. And? The second guard swallowed. Mr. Grant is the owner of this bank. The silence that followed was absolute. The bank's grand interior gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers. The marble floors reflected the quiet hum of daily transactions, customers murmuring in hushed voices as they waited their turn. But at the center of it all, tension crackled like static in the air. Alexander Grant stood tall, his patience thinning, but his composure unshaken. He had played along long enough. He had tried to be civil, to follow the bank's so-called process, but now it was clear this wasn't about protocol, it was about power, and Richard Holloway was drunk on it. Reaching into his briefcase, Alexander pulled out his official ID and a gold-embossed credential, setting them on the counter with deliberate precision. His movements were slow, controlled, a silent warning that he wasn't someone to be dismissed so easily. "I'd appreciate some professionalism," he said, his voice smooth yet edged with quiet authority. "I know my rights." Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if Alexander had just told the most absurd joke. "Oh ho, look at this guy," he sneered, his voice laced with amusement. "Knows his rights." He leaned on the counter, scanning the ID with a half-hearted glance before rolling his eyes. "Listen, pal, I don't care how many big words you throw around. You don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a slap. A few customers shifted uncomfortably. Some turned away, pretending not to hear, while others stole glances at Alexander, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Alexander remained still, his expression unreadable. He had dealt with men like Richard before, the type who thought their position gave them the right to decide who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. Richard, mistaking his silence for defeat, smirked wider. With a dramatic flick of his wrist, he snapped his fingers at the security guard standing near the entrance. "Escort this clown out," he ordered, as if he were tossing out garbage. "We don't deal with scammers here." The security guards hesitated. Their instincts told them something was off. Usually, when someone was accused of fraud, they panicked, argued, or tried to flee. But this man, he just stood there, watching, waiting. There was no fear in his eyes, no desperation, just patience, as if he already knew how this would end. Richard's smirk faltered slightly at their hesitation. "What are you waiting for?" he barked. "Get him out." One of the guards, Officer Daniels, stepped forward, picking up the ID resting on the counter. He barely glanced at it before flipping to the second credential, the gold-embossed one. His breath hitched the moment his eyes scanned the name. His grip on the ID tightened as his pulse spiked. Something was wrong. He turned slightly, his face pale, and hurriedly whispered to his partner, Officer Brooks. "Check the name." Brooks, confused by Daniel's reaction, took the ID and frowned. But the second his eyes landed on it, his entire demeanor shifted. His jaw clenched, and he immediately straightened, standing at attention like a soldier caught off guard. Silence stretched across the room. The two guards exchanged a glance, one filled with panic, realization, and immediate regret. Alexander Grant. The name echoed in their minds like a siren. This wasn't just some customer. This wasn't some fraud case. This was the most powerful man in the entire bank. And standing just a few feet away, completely unaware of the storm about to hit him, Richard Holloway still smirked in triumph. "Come on, gentlemen, what's the holdup?" he snapped impatiently. "Don't let him waste any more of our time. Get him out." Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. Brooks swallowed hard, gripping the ID so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, before either of them could move, their radios crackled to life. "Hold your positions. Hold your positions. Now!" The voice on the other end was frantic. The shift in energy was instantaneous. The guards froze. The teller gasped. Customers stopped mid-conversation, their eyes darting toward the growing commotion. Richard's smirk flickered just slightly, confusion replacing his arrogance. And then, as realization slowly crept in, the room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Something was about to change, and Richard Holloway had no idea what was coming next. The silence in the bank was suffocating. The customers, the tellers, even the background hum of machines counting money, All of it faded into an eerie stillness. And then, everything happened at once. The security guards, who had moments ago hesitated, suddenly snapped into motion. Their bodies stiffened as if someone had just barked an order at them. Then, without warning, they rushed forward. Richard Holloway smirked in satisfaction, folding his arms across his chest. "That's more like it," he said, nodding in approval. "Get this guy out of my bank now." But something was off. The guards weren't moving toward Alexander Grant in the way security typically escorted a suspect. There was no aggression, no forceful stance. Their movements weren't those of enforcers about to eject a troublemaker. They were precise, respectful, almost formal. And then it happened. The security chief stopped in front of Alexander Grant and snapped into a salute. The gesture was sharp, crisp, military-level precision. The room froze. Customers gasped. The tellers stared. A pen fell to the floor with a tiny clink, the only sound in the stunned, heavy silence. Richard's smirk vanished. His confident stance faltered as confusion crept onto his face. His arms slowly dropped to his sides, his breathing suddenly uneasy. The security chief, still holding his salute, turned his head slightly and spoke in a voice loud enough for the entire bank to hear. "Sir, do you even know who this man is?" Richard blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He glanced around, expecting someone, anyone, to clarify what was happening. Alexander Grant, for the first time since entering the bank, allowed a slow smirk to cross his lips. Calmly, without saying a word, he reached into his inner suit pocket. The movement was deliberate, a silent message that the show wasn't over yet. With absolute confidence, he pulled out one final card and placed it on the counter with a soft thud. The gold-plated lettering gleamed under the chandelier's light. Owner's identification badge. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman clapped a hand over her mouth. The teller, who had been nervously fidgeting just moments ago, went pale. Richard staggered back. His face had drained of all color, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. This has to be a mistake," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands trembled as he reached for the ID, his fingers hovering over it as if touching it would burn him. He swallowed hard as he read the words again, his heart pounding in his chest. Alexander Grant, CEO, sole owner and majority shareholder. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just some wealthy man. This wasn't just a big-shot businessman. This was his boss. This was the man who owned every brick, every desk, every vault, every single account in this entire bank. And Richard Holloway had just mocked him, insulted him, and tried to have him thrown out of his own institution. The security guards took a sharp step back, their posture rigid with respect. The teller scrambled to straighten herself, suddenly looking as if she might faint. But Alexander wasn't done. He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and the man who had so gleefully humiliated him just moments ago. "So, Richard," he said, his voice calm yet laced with authority, "you were saying something about people like me not belonging here?" Richard's lips parted uselessly. He struggled for words, for excuses, for anything that could salvage this moment. But there was nothing. Alexander studied him, eyes sharp. "You accused me of fraud. You mocked my withdrawal request. You tried to have me removed like I was some common criminal." He let the words settle, making sure everyone in the bank felt the weight of them. "Tell me, Richard, how does it feel to know you just disrespected the man who signs your paycheck?" A customer near the back let out a stunned chuckle. Someone whispered, "Oh, damn." Richard choked on his own breath. He wanted to apologize, to beg, to grovel, but the words wouldn't form. His body had gone into full panic mode, his mind struggling to undo the damage that had already been done. Alexander sighed, shaking his head. "I've dealt with a lot of people like you," he mused. entitled, arrogant, convinced that a suit and a corner office gives them the right to judge others. He locked eyes with Richard, his presence utterly commanding. But you made one very critical mistake today. Richard's voice cracked as he whispered, What mistake? Alexander let his smirk return. You assumed I was beneath you. Richard felt his knees weaken. The weight of the moment was crushing him. The security chief cleared his throat. Sir, he addressed Alexander formally, what would you like us to do with him? Alexander didn't answer immediately. He took a long, slow breath, savoring the moment. He could fire Richard on the spot, humiliate him, make an example of him in front of everyone here. But instead, he leaned forward and whispered, just loud enough for Richard to hear, Pack your things. Richard's entire body locked up. Sir, please. Alexander turned away, signaling to the guards. Escort him out, he said. The irony of it all was almost poetic. The same men Richard had commanded to throw Alexander out were now grabbing him by the arms instead. Wait, please. It was just a mistake. I didn't know. Richard's voice rose in desperation as the guards started pulling him toward the exit. Alexander adjusted his cufflinks, watching with calm satisfaction. Funny, he mused. That's exactly what I said to you earlier. The doors swung open, and as Richard Holloway was dragged out of the very bank he thought he ruled, the last thing he saw was the entire room watching in silence, stunned at what had just unfolded. Alexander turned back to the teller, who looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Now, he said casually, about that withdrawal? She nodded frantically. Oh, of course, sir, right away. As Alexander stepped forward, the murmurs in the bank erupted into hushed, electrified whispers. The man they had doubted was the most powerful person in the building, and Richard Holloway had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The bank fell into utter silence as the weight of reality crashed down on everyone in the room. The truth wasn't just shocking, it was earth-shattering. The new owner of the entire banking chain had just been mocked, insulted, and nearly thrown out of his own establishment. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Tellers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their hands frozen over keyboards. Customers whispered urgently, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding chaos. Richard Holloway staggered back, his body trembling as if the floor beneath him had suddenly disappeared. His face, previously smug and full of condescension, was now drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed, struggling for words, but nothing came out. Alexander Grant took a slow, deliberate step forward. His posture was unshaken, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with authority. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, in a voice calm, yet devastatingly sharp, he spoke. I was here to inspect customer service, he said, his words carrying through the lobby like a final verdict. And you failed spectacularly. Richard let out a choked sound, his breathing ragged. Sir, I didn't know. I would never. His voice wavered, his arrogance completely shattered. He tripped over his own feet, reaching out blindly, as if he could somehow grab hold of his crumbling career. Please, he stammered, sweat trickling down his temples. It was a misunderstanding. I thought. Alexander held up a single hand, and immediately Richard fell silent. The power dynamic had shifted so drastically, so suddenly, that the manager no longer existed as a person in control. He was nothing. The security chief didn't wait for further instructions. He took one firm step forward, his voice sharp and unwavering. Escort him out! The very same guards that Richard had snapped his fingers at just moments ago grabbed him by the arms. No, wait, please! Richard cried, his voice desperate now. Mr. Grant, I swear, I had no idea. Give me a chance, I didn't mean. Alexander simply watched, expression calm, unbothered. Customers murmured, some shaking their heads, others openly smirking at the poetic justice of it all. A few still filmed, capturing every humiliating second. As the guards dragged him toward the door, Richard tried one last time. He turned, his eyes pleading. "Sir, I'll do better. Just give me another chance, please." Alexander exhaled through his nose, his smirk barely noticeable. "You know," he mused, "that's exactly what a good customer would have said to you earlier. Shame you never gave them the same courtesy." Richard froze, his lips parting, just as the guards shoved the glass doors open. The sunlit street outside was filled with onlookers, some stopping to watch as the once powerful manager was thrown out, humiliated, speechless, and utterly defeated. The doors swung shut behind him. Inside, the tension slowly dissipated, replaced by an air of disbelief and silent respect. The teller, still shaken, turned to Alexander. "Sir," she stammered, "about that withdrawal?" Alexander Grant smiled for the first time that day. "Yes," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Let's take care of that." And with that, he stepped forward, the true owner of the bank, the room, and the moment. The tension in the bank slowly dissipated, replaced by a wave of stunned silence. Every eye remained fixed on Alexander Grant, the man they had doubted, insulted, and nearly thrown out, only to discover he was the true owner of everything around them. Alexander finally turned back to the young teller, his expression no longer stern, but calm. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Now," he said gently, his voice smooth and composed, "can I make my withdrawal?" The teller, still shaken but now overwhelmed with admiration, nodded frantically. Yes, of course, sir. Right away," she stammered, her hands moving swiftly over the keyboard, processing the transaction with more care than she had ever given before. The staff, who had once hesitated to serve him, now rushed to assist, treating him with the utmost respect. Papers were handled with precision, procedures followed flawlessly, and every word was spoken with a reverence that had been absent before. But Alexander wasn't just here to make a point. He was here to make a difference. As the teller handed him the withdrawal slip, he pulled out a check and began writing. When he slid it back across the counter, her eyes widened. It was a substantial donation, made out to a foundation for financial education for underprivileged black youth. A murmur spread through the bank as people realized what he had done. Customers exchanged looks of admiration, some even clapping softly, the gesture growing into a heartfelt applause. The new bank staff, humbled by the lesson they had just witnessed, bowed their heads slightly in respect as Alexander made his way toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, he paused. Outside, through the glass panel, Richard Holloway stood in the cold. His suit was wrinkled, his once proud stance slumped in defeat. His hands hung limply at his sides as he watched, his expression hollow with realization. He had lost everything, not because of policy, not because of an error, but because of his own arrogance and prejudice. Alexander met his gaze for a moment, then gave him one final look, not of hatred, not of anger, but of pity. Then, without another word, he stepped outside. The doors closed behind him, and Richard Holloway was left to stare at the consequences of his own actions.